By this point, we all know the major failings that Battlefield 5 as a game had, and unfortunately, those failings ended up defining the product, and they shaped its perception amongst the gaming community. There were stories of a rushed development cycle, there was this really strange take on World War II, a lack of content at launch, an extremely buggy update legacy, a very lackluster live service, and huge gaps between meaningful content drops, and many broken promises along the way. The game largely failed to live up to any expectations that EA and DICE might have set for it, and in the eyes of the gaming community, Battlefield 5 was just a big misstep for the Battlefield franchise. It was, and still is, a game to forget almost. However, there are some redeeming qualities, and they are a little bit easier to find than you might expect. But now that Battlefield 5 is all but over, there's no more content updates set to be delivered, I think it's the right time to highlight some of those elements and maybe show what Battlefield 5 did well and what could be taken forward in the future. First up, we'll start before the launch, which would be hard to believe there's anything good in there, but there are two elements buried in the rather negative swirl that the game had. There was talk about the gunplay, and a brand new system called Fortifications. These two elements alone transpired to be enough to keep me playing Battlefield 5 through all of the very low points that it ended up suffering, and that tells you how good they were, and what important decisions they must have been for the game before it launched. We'll start off with the gunplay. DICE turned over a new leaf with Battlefield 5. They were moving away from the less liked balance and performance that they implemented in Battlefield 1, and they moved towards a system where guns just did what you expected them to do. DICE eliminated the weapon effects of suppression, limiting the mechanic to only visual effects that would indicate to a player when they were in danger and would be better off taking cover. Previous games allowed suppression to influence weapon mechanics, increasing bullet spread mainly, and that would throw off a player's aim, affecting the outcome of gunfights. Increased spread, that would result in bullets not hitting the target that was being aimed at, even if the player's aim was true and correct. And this led to player frustration. It started in the Battlefield 3 days, where the effect was most pronounced, and very early on in the element's life cycle. Moving through Battlefield games, the effect was lessened over time, but the effect on weapon mechanics specifically, that ended with Battlefield 1. DICE finally decided that suppression would be a visual-only element moving forwards, and that was the first good step for the gunplay in this game. Then of course there is the general gunplay itself, which was its own big step forwards. DICE started to make the guns feel more physical, to a point where you'd be able to tell when they were becoming inaccurate due to sustained fire, and at this point you'd then have to pause, let the gun reset before carrying on. They were making that feeling a lot easier to spot. Weapons appeared to be balanced around different engagement distances, as they were in Battlefield 1, but Battlefield 5 didn't have those harder limits in place that created big frustrations with Battlefield 1 gunplay. Guns in that game, they weren't very malleable, and they weren't able to be customized in any sort of meaningful way to change their general behavior and fit into a different role. You literally had to go and pick a completely different version of that weapon, and the whole thing just felt a little bit like DICE was trying to guide people into doing certain things, rather than letting the player do what they wanted to do. Battlefield 5 tried to change that by allowing weapons to become a little bit more effective outside of their intended engagement range, but their effectiveness would be slightly worse than picking a weapon designed to work in that different role. The whole system was built around the elements used in Battlefield 3, which was a gunplay system that many players really enjoyed, but there would be more recoil to deal with. Now, for the most part, the vision that DICE set out before launch, with all those different articles telling us about what the gunplay would be like, that kind of came out to be true. Guns were simple and easy to use, but they were much harder to master and control outside of their intended engagement range. More recoil was present. DICE opted to convert what used to be spread in previous Battlefield games into recoil. This made guns easier to read, as spread was a mechanic that was hard to communicate to players during gunfights. Spread was almost invisible. Since the individual bullets fired from the gun, they're very difficult to track, especially with fully automatic weapons. Recoil, that's much easier to see what's going on. The gun model moves around on the screen, it moves up and it goes from side to side as you fire it, and that would allow you to track the weapon movement and correct it when it was needed. This created a much more readable gunplay system, and perhaps the only downside was that the recoil patterns that DICE implemented for the guns, they didn't have a limiter in place for the horizontal recoil, and that meant sometimes your gun would randomly jump from right to left or from left to right within the confines of the recoil pattern, and that added an element of unpredictability. However, this isn't really something that I felt was hugely impactful on my own gameplay experience. Some people have chosen to speak about it and they've said that they didn't really like it, but honestly, I rarely noticed that that was happening. This positive step forward with the gunplay, giving players a more physical experience with lethal weapons that killed people fairly fast, that was well received by the core community, and it stood out as a change based on player feedback after the fairly mixed response to the gunplay in Battlefield 1. That was one of the weaker points of Battlefield 1. That game pretty much did everything else really, really well. However, we all know the stories. DICE, after launch, they started messing with the time to kill, and attempted to walk back on some of their innovations due to data that they had, but didn't show anybody, that less skilled players weren't having a great time with the game. That created a huge debate in the community, and quite a lot of bad sentiment towards DICE from the core community. Those players felt that one of the only good aspects of the game was being dumbed down for the sake of lower skilled players unlikely to sink the same sort of time into the game that they would. That somewhat soured the gunplay topic for me, always knowing that DICE had built this system, clearly had some sort of internal debate about whether it was really something that they wanted to do. They ended up going with it for launch, and then they decided to try and change it about 3 weeks later. It felt like, again, another element of Battlefield 5 where the team didn't really have a true vision of what they wanted to achieve, a single vision of what they wanted to achieve. And behind all of that debate, the original idea that was implemented for launch was a really good one. It's just unfortunate that most people will remember the launch of Battlefield 5 as a couple of weeks of really good gunplay, and then the news coming out that that gunplay was supposedly going away. Now, moving on from gunplay, but sticking before launch here, we have something else to talk about: Fortifications. This is a feature that I see as DICE basically completing the loop of destruction, allowing players to semi-reverse the effects of destruction and take greater control of the map flow and gameplay that was happening around them. Since the first Bad Company spin-off in 2008, Destruction, it became an instant hit with Battlefield fans, and it gave the franchise a solid step forwards and an element at the time that not many other FPS games could really compete with. The original Bad Company's Destruction, it felt like a feature without any limits whatsoever. Proper considerations for it hadn't really been made, but at the time, it was something brand new, it was fresh, and it was crazy. So for that game, it didn't really matter. People loved it, and so much so that DICE refined it and built upon it for every single Battlefield game afterwards, and it's basically a core pillar of the franchise now. In Battlefield 4, Levolution took things a step further, a bigger sort of overarching section of Destruction. It had these map-altering moments, and Destruction was at the centre of those. It was supposed to be a technical marvel, and it was, about 6 months after launch when they fixed all the bugs that made it crash the game, but it was also a Marmite moment. Some people loved it, and other people didn't like it. There is no denying, though, that it made Battlefield 4 look mightily impressive, standing next to other FPS games at that point in time. Now, Battlefield 1, it scaled back those larger events, and instead it used Bad Company 2 as inspiration, allowing for more free-form destruction, but with more intelligent limitations that would stop the destruction from leading to a breakdown in gameplay. And Battlefield 5 channeled that same energy, but it implemented decay on top of that, where a larger destruction moment would have occurred, and then over time, smaller elements would break off or snap away and then crash down to the floor. Narvik's town, full of wooden houses, is a really good example of this. When a tank rolls through, smashing things up, over time, more snow would slip off the roofs and more wood would break off and fall down to the ground. It was a subtle change, but one that assured almost every time you visited a place on a map that that place would then be different. It wouldn't look the same. And that's where Fortification comes in, on that very endpoint as well. Instead of only destroying things that allow you to change the map, what if players could build stuff and change the map instead? Maybe they could build cover and battlements to gain a tactical holding point or to reinforce a location for a defensive maneuver. Fortifications allow players to take direct control of map flow by building tank traps on the road or digging trenches across fields, rebuilding walls with sandbags. It reversed destruction, but in a way that would let players know that destruction had already played its part. It's not like you were hitting the reverse button and things just went back to the way they were. You were building things in their place to sort of counter the destruction and give some sense of flow back to that area. And that's where I feel that it was this point of completing the circle on destruction, finding a solution to an age-old issue of the feature, potentially creating worse map flow than if the destruction had not occurred. Finally, players had a way to get rid of that line of sight, cover off that angle, after something that had previously been solid was no longer there. Fortifications is massive for the Battlefield franchise. It's one of the biggest features to come to the game in a long, long time. And whilst the implementation, first of all, in Battlefield 5 wasn't brilliant, it was a bit finicky, detection wasn't amazing, over the course of the game's life, work was put in to streamline the system. With the launch of the Pacific, DICE sped up the building animations to better match the gameplay pace. Now we have better building animations as well, and better detection of individual elements, and that leads to a much smoother overall feature. Fortifications is an element that I can see very easily being applied to the next Battlefield game coming next year. It is the answer to destruction. I don't really see any downsides to having this feature present in all future Battlefield games. Okay, so those were the two major features before the launch that I really saw as positives for Battlefield 5. And now let's talk about after the launch. Unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount to talk about here, but I'll talk about the first big point, and it came nearly a year into the game's live service, the Pacific update. 2 brand new maps, 2 new factions, a move in the war over to a brand new theatre, a renewed focus on slightly better visual authenticity, new iconic weapons and vehicles. The Pacific update is probably the best update that Battlefield 5 received during its life cycle. DICE focused on the invasion fantasy of the Pacific Theatre. They built maps around the breakthrough game mode, as they did in Battlefield 1 when the mode was called Operations. A core team within DICE with massive experience in the franchise led development on the Pacific, with Lars Gustafsson at the helm. And the experience was just night and day in comparison to all the European early war efforts that DICE had put in so far. The Pacific update felt like a brand new game. It felt like the World War II game that DICE should have been making since the very beginning. The tone was more serious, it was more defiant. It was like the update was trying to stand up on its own 2 feet, and it was head and shoulders above anything else that came before it. The new weapons tied in with American and Japanese shouting on the beaches of Iwo Jima, it gave Battlefield 5 the chance to properly bury the issues of its past and work forwards onto something better. The 6 weeks post-launch of the Pacific update were probably the best that I had during the lifetime of Battlefield 5, and it's a little bit sad that it took nearly a year for that to happen. And the only reason that it was 6 weeks long is because DICE once again shot themselves in the foot and tried to mess with something that no one in the community was asking them to mess with: the gunplay. All the goodwill they earned, all the player excitement they created, all of that was gone in one forum post. It was an excellent moment for DICE when they launched the Pacific. It finally felt like the team was united under one vision for the game, and it felt like they knew where they wanted to go with Battlefield 5. But that turned out not to be the case. Just 6 weeks later, the cracks showed once again. A team divided. A team set on changing something that they themselves built to solve issues of a previous game. After Update 5.2 before Christmas in late 2019, player numbers around Battlefield 5, they did start to drop off quite considerably, to my eyes. They never returned to the heights of the launch of the Pacific. It was too much for some players for a second time. DICE would come back to this issue where they wanted to change a core feature of the game that most people appeared to like. It was as if the team at DICE at the time was all fighting in groups to get their bit into the game at the expense of everyone else's. And this bit, this gunplay, this was at the expense of the Pacific content. It was a disjointed team, and that was clear to see from the continually buggy, messy, element-conflicting patches that were delivered for Battlefield 5 after that point. In February 2020, DICE released the Solomon Islands map, part of Chapter 6 for the game, another good point for things moving forwards. More new weapons, more fighting in the Pacific, a new map to play. Things were looking up. Players re-engaged with a set of content that looked like a continuation of the Pacific Theatre, but unfortunately, that's pretty much as far as things got. A few months after, it was announced that support for Battlefield 5 was being cancelled, and instead focus would be shifted over to the next Battlefield game. DICE were announcing they ended their own fight to make Battlefield 5 a game that people would perceive as good or a success. For the longest time they've been fighting an uphill battle, and they decided to just stop. Unfortunately, I don't really think you can say at any point in Battlefield 5's life that the game was truly a success, but I will say that the 6-week period after the Pacific launched, that was the best period that the game had, and I genuinely really enjoyed playing Battlefield 5 during that period. One final update would arrive in June, it was announced, with a conversion back to European fighting, a delivery of USA versus Germany battles as this last hurrah for the game, and ironically, it turned out to be one of the best content drops for the game. It gave us USA versus Germany, which is what a lot of people thought Battlefield 5 would be all about from the start. We got 10 new weapons, 2 new maps, 6 new vehicles, 3 new gadgets, new grenades, new cosmetics to fit the European US troops better. It was a great update, but it was bittersweet because that was all she wrote. We weren't getting anything else beyond that point. So yes, Battlefield 5 was a good game, but only in very, very small time frame points. And so therefore you can say that Battlefield 5 overall wasn't a good game. The negative sentiment around the game fully took hold earlier on, and DICE was fighting that uphill battle from the very start. But I would argue that without those initial controversies, if the game had still gone on to have the live service, the short amount of development time that the game had, the less than stellar support and the buggy updates, that might well have brought Battlefield 5 down anyway, even without those controversies. DICE's track record for the game was extremely poor, and it rarely improved, despite the comments saying that things would get better over time. The last update, admittedly, was very good, and lots of the bugs that had been present for a long time through the game have now been rectified, and the game is in a good spot technically. Does that mean that it's still going to appeal to everybody? No. Does that mean that people are suddenly going to flock to it because now there's content there that people want to play? I don't think so, because there's no more updates coming. So why would you want to invest your time in a game that you know is not going to get any support moving forwards? I understand that making games isn't easy, and Battlefield 5 had a really tough time. But when you're making AAA games, there's a certain standard that people expect, and Battlefield 5 and DICE, they fell far below that this time around. Thanks very much for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and leave me a rating and a comment. It's always appreciated. And I'll catch you in the next one.